Professor Sackett-Taylor here again. This is the second video in the series that I made for Chapter 4 on public goods and common property resources as it relates to Econ 321 natural resource economics. So in the last video, we talked about common property resources. Let's pick up where we left off and talk about public goods. So just a reminder about the way that we categorize all kinds of goods in our economic systems. They can either be rival or non-rival, and excludable or non-excludable. Collectively, that means that there are 4 categories of goods. The last video focused on goods that were rival but non-excludable, common property resources. We talked about the problems that are associated with open access to these kinds of resources that lead to what we call the tragedy of the commons. On a similar note, we want to talk about another kind of good that is also non-excludable. This kind of good is a public good. Public goods are available to everybody, non-excludable. But the use by one person does not reduce the availability to others, therefore non-rival. So you might be asking yourself, what's the problem? We're not going to see tragedy of the commons like we did with common property resources, but we are going to see free riders, individuals or groups that obtain benefits of public goods without having to pay for them. There are a lot of debates about the best way to provide public goods. You can think about public goods like street lights or nice roads to drive on, national defense, public water supply, right? Here in this video series, I'm going to use the example of our national park system, conservation of public land. So what is the best system for providing these public goods? Well, the question at hand really, just like with common property resources, environmental economists always want to say, how could we use markets to solve this problem? In what ways could a private market deal with the efficient allocation of these things? So the question really is, can we rely on private markets to provide an appropriate level of public goods? The answer is no. In many cases, private markets will not provide public goods at all, let alone to the level that we really need them. Because of the non-excludable nature and non-rival characteristic of public goods, no individual consumer has any incentive to pay for it since they can enjoy it freely. However, we have thought about asking people for donations to provide these things. This is a second possibility. Donations, however, tend to not raise sufficient funds for the efficient provision of a public good. Since the public goods are non-excludable, each person can receive the benefits regardless of the amount that they pay. So while some people might be willing to donate money to, say, public radio, many others will simply listen to it without paying anything. Same with national parks, same with streetlights if it was up to donation only. Those who choose to benefit from the public good without paying are called free riders. So decisions on the provision of environmental public goods have to be made through a political system. Congress, for example, decided on funding the national park system. I love the national parks. My husband and I, when we got married, made a promise to one another that we would visit a different national park every year. We've been married for 3 years, and so far we've seen the Redwood National Forest, the Hawaiian volcanoes, and Rocky Mountain National Park. These are places that feel otherworldly in the way that they are untouched, pristine nature. There's so much value in conserving these spaces, but many people don't know about how the national park system came to be. So let's watch this short video.
From the Grand Canyon to Mount Rushmore to the Blue Ridge Mountains, the National Park Service, it's the government agency responsible for maintaining America's abundance of natural and cultural wonders. By the mid-1800s, American settlers were moving west and discovering new landscapes as they laid claims to lands in Texas, California, New Mexico, and Arizona. Many Americans were enamored with the natural beauty of the Trans-Mississippi West, which was so different from the East Coast and Europe. Some enterprising travelers realized these natural sites would make good spots for tourism and recreation. In 1855, a British man named James Hutchings, along with 2 Indian guides, visited the Yosemite Valley and began to write articles promoting California's scenic wonders. Almost overnight, Yosemite became a destination. It was so popular that President Abraham Lincoln put it under protection during the Civil War. But Yosemite was not the first national park. In 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant declared Yellowstone the first ever national park. It wasn't until 1890 that John Muir, a Scottish-American naturalist, successfully convinced Congress to protect the Yosemite area. Muir would continue to have a major influence on the creation and preservation of new parks, along with President Theodore Roosevelt. Between 1901 and 1909, President Teddy Roosevelt, who believed that experiencing nature was instrumental in building American character, created 5 new parks, including Yosemite, and claimed over 100 million acres of national forest. He also signed the 1906 Antiquities Act, which gave the President of the United States authority to create national monuments from federal lands. National parks were springing up all over the country. But it wasn't until 1916 that President Woodrow Wilson signed an act to establish a National Park Service run by the federal government. The Organic Act gathered the 14 national parks and 21 national monuments into a federal system. Congress declared the fundamental purpose of the national park system: to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Over the next 2 decades, Congress expanded the national park system, adding the Grand Canyon, Bryce Canyon, Acadia, the Great Smoky Mountains, and Shenandoah to the list of national parks. Throughout the 20th century, the service continued to expand, thanks to some important pieces of legislation. The Historic Sites Act of 1935 allowed the government to give historic properties protected status. The Wilderness Act of 1965 created a policy of securing wilderness areas for the benefit of the American people. In 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act required museums, including those in the national parks, to return excavated remains to their cultural descendants. By its 100th anniversary in 2016, the National Park Service employed more than 20,000 people and upwards of 300,000 volunteers, presiding over more than 400 parks, monuments, and other sites. Today, the National Park Service still works with communities across America, preserving nature, local history, and providing the public with places to explore, learn, and reflect.
So you can see that without government, without Congress passing legislation, the national parks wouldn't be where they are today. That land would have been developed and the environment around there degraded, species eliminated. So the answer to the public goods problem is government regulation. If the amount of the public good can be varied continuously, then the optimal quantity to produce is a quantity where the marginal cost of providing that last unit is equal to the sum of all the value that the consumers are willing to pay for it. This is different than in private goods. In private goods, we usually, when we take individual demand for a product and we want to create market demand, we ask ourselves, at this price, how much does this person want? At this same price, how much does that person want? And et cetera, and we add them. This results in a horizontal additive nature of demand curves. When you add individual demand curves, the market demand curve is horizontally further out. However, with public goods, because there is the non-excludable nature of them and free riders, You can't ask yourself at this price, how many do they want? In other words, you say, if people want access to this quantity, what would they be willing to pay? In other words, what is their intrinsic personal value? And then we add every individual value to get the market demand for that product or that good or that service. And so in this case, you end up with a vertical expansion of demand. So this guarantees that the last unit of the public good will cost as much to produce as the value it gives to all the consumers who want access to it. Unfortunately, we still see the public goods problem at work. It means that we're going to overuse the earth, our environment, as a sink for waste and pollution, right? If air quality, if water quality, if open land is a public good, we're going to overuse it, which leads to environmental degradation. If we wanted to conserve those spaces, it takes money, but people will benefit from it whether or not they pay. These people are called free riders. Unfortunately, the provision of public goods often requires a lot of people to come together to take collective action. This means there are high transaction costs. So we usually have to organize, obtain information, get legal aid. This is why we have to push Congress to make these decisions on behalf of all of the American people. So here's a discussion question for you, thinking about the difference between private and public goods. Do you think it's possible to draw a clear distinction between all private goods and all public goods? Which of the following would you consider public goods? Farmland, forests, beachfront property, a highway, a city park, a parking lot, a sports arena. Which of these things are public and which of these things are private? What rules of the market or public policy should apply to providing the efficient amount of these goods? Think about it, reflect on it, and bring your thoughts to our next class, where we'll talk about both common property resources and public goods. That's it for chapter 4. Thanks for hanging in there with me. See you next time.